Tonight, we step back into the Middle Ages, a time often painted with images of filth, ignorance and brutality. But what if many of those ideas you've heard your whole life are simply wrong? Tonight we peel back the myths and look at the truth hidden underneath. If this kind of slow, careful storytelling feels like your kind of escape, consider joining me by subscribing and leaving a like. And in the comments, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always striking to see how this little corner of history connects people across the world. Now, dim the lights, let yourself relax, and let's untangle the medieval facts that never really were. Imagine a dark hall, the air thick with smoke. In front of you stands a coffin studded with cruel iron spikes, the Iron Maiden. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy walking into history's quieter, stranger corners with me. You've seen this device in films, museums, even games. But the truth is simpler and stranger. It never belonged to the Middle Ages. The spikes are not medieval cruelty at all, but a later invention dressed up as ancient horror. And if this coffin is a lie, what waits inside when we open it? Picture that coffin again, tall and iron-bound, its shadow heavy across the floor. The spikes you expect to find inside, the very image of medieval terror, do not come from the Middle Ages at all. What you're really seeing is not a relic of knights and inquisitors, but an invention crafted centuries later, built to make an audience shiver. The device we call the Iron Maiden never appears in medieval chronicles, trial records, or the manuals of punishment that describe whipping posts and gallows in careful detail. Its silence in the true sources tells you everything. The first printed description surfaced in 1784, when the Enlightenment writer Johann Philipp Siebenkees conjured up a story of a spiked coffin supposedly used in Nuremberg. It was not evidence, but theatre on the page. Then, in the early 1800s, a showman named Johann Nicholas Wilhelm displayed an actual model in a museum, cobbled together from older pieces of iron, and claimed it was authentic. This was the moment the myth took physical form, and audiences believed it. If you enjoy journeys into the hidden and unsettling corners of history, consider supporting this channel by subscribing. From that point forward, the phantom coffin spread. Museums displayed replicas. Writers and filmmakers staged dramatic scenes of prisoners closed inside with spikes catching light as the door swung shut. Tour guides whispered about organs pierced but not destroyed, so victims lingered in agony. The story multiplied because it was too good, too ghastly, too perfect to resist. But here is the important correction. The Iron Maiden was never medieval. It was born in the late 18th century and put on display in the 19th. It was not built to inflict pain, but to satisfy imagination. It served the same role as a wax figure or a fairground attraction, shaping a past that audiences already thought was monstrous. The attraction worked like stage lighting in a theatre. Focus the beam on one prop, exaggerate the shadows, and an entire age looks darker than it truly was. The Iron Maiden exaggerated punishment until the Middle Ages themselves seemed like a parade of spikes and chains. From then on, every bailiff, every courtroom, every dungeon in a story could be draped in that same terror. The coffin became a prop for culture, not a record of fact. Still, the lie travelled far. Textbooks copied the tale. Visitors stood in front of reconstructed coffins and accepted without question that this was daily life in the medieval town. Films made the spikes drip with fresh blood. Novels gave the coffin a voice in the screams of its victims. And through these retellings, the Iron Maiden lived on more vividly than it ever could have if it were real. The truth is that medieval punishment took other forms. Public executions reminded witnesses of the law's power. Lesser crimes were met with fines, exile, short imprisonment, or display in stocks. There were beatings and branding, yes, but also ordinary confinement and the threat of banishment from one's community. Complex machines of torture belonged more to the later periods of religious persecution, not to the early Middle Ages of castles and guilds. Devices like the Iron Maiden, the so-called Pair of Anguish, or myths of widespread use of chastity belts were creations of later centuries, either inventions or misattributions that got folded backward into medieval life. Seen this way, the Iron Maiden becomes a mirror. It reflects what Victorians and 18th century collectors wanted to believe, more than it shows what lords or inquisitors ever did. They wanted a dark age to contrast against their own modern selves, so they gave that imagined past more spikes, more chains, and more terror than it ever carried in reality. The key takeaway is plain. The Iron Maiden is not a piece of medieval torture. It is an 18th and 19th century performance prop. Its spikes pierced only imagination, never flesh. Yet the fiction was strong enough to wound the way we picture the past, and that wound remains. And this leaves you with a troubling thought. If such a famous object can be conjured out of nothing, and still sit heavy in our museums and stories, how many other parts of history are shaped the same way? How many times have we been sold a vision of the past that says more about the storyteller than about the people who lived and breathed there? The coffin shows us how quickly silence in the record can be filled by fantasy. It held no victims, but it still holds our imagination captive. And it reminds us to ask, with every story we accept, is this what happened, or is this what later centuries wanted us to believe? Because if even the most infamous emblem of medieval cruelty is a fiction, then the horizon of past knowledge may not be as flat or as empty as legend makes it. Imagine standing at the edge of a wide sea. The horizon stretches out steady and endless, and you picture sailors of long ago staring at that line. It is tempting to believe they feared an abyss, or spoke of ships tumbling into a void. That picture is vivid, simple, and wrong. Medieval Europe did not believe the earth was flat, and the story that Columbus proved is it round conceals a much older, more precise truth. The myth thrives because of its neatness. A flat world fits into a tidy tale of ignorance, with one daring sailor smashing superstition. You have likely heard it in school, seen it acted out in films, and absorbed it as a kind of moral. The clever modern mind rescuing fools from darkness. But a neat story often hides a complicated reality. Medieval scholars inherited centuries of knowledge about a round earth, knowledge that was not whispered legend, but common teaching. That knowledge was ancient. From Greek writers, from Indian astronomy, and especially from the Islamic Golden Age, the spherical earth was well described. Their arguments were mathematical, not mystical. One clear example comes from Abu Rayhan Biruni, a scholar of the 11th century who measured the Earth's radius using mountains and angles of sight. His figure came within tens of kilometres of the modern value. That is not the work of superstition. It is careful observation, precise geometry, and transmission of knowledge across cultures. So the idea of a round Earth entered the medieval world not as a revelation, but as standard fact. Monks copied it into manuscripts. Teachers explained it to students with diagrams. Mariners relied on it when keeping their reckoning at sea. A curved world is written into their maps, even those decorated with angels or beasts. The decoration does not erase the geometry. Now, picture a merchant ship. The captain talks of winds, supplies, and how far until the next shore. He does not warn about falling from the edge of the world, because such a thought would have been nonsense to him. The dangers were real enough without it. Storms, sickness, hunger. They did not imagine the sea dropping away beneath their hulls. That false fear was supplied later by storytellers who wanted their Middle Ages foolish and their moderns bright. Where, then, does the flat earth story come from? Like the Iron Maiden, it is a later invention. Columbus had opponents, but not because they thought the world was flat. They worried about distance and supply. He claimed Asia was closer than it truly was. That miscalculation was the real gamble, not whether the sea had edges. The tale of brave Columbus. Against ignorant flat earthers took root centuries later, especially in the 19th century. The American writer Washington Irving, in his popular biography of Columbus, gave the world the dramatic courtroom scenes of scholars doubting the round earth. These accounts were not true. They were imaginative reconstruction. They became influential, copied in textbooks, and repeated to children until they seemed like fact. The effect is irony. While medieval scholars drew diagrams and measured shadows, later centuries flattened them into caricature. Their real intellectual world, mathematical, observant, attentive, was turned into a cartoon of superstition so that the modern era could flatter itself. The reality deserves more respect. Imagine sitting in a medieval classroom. The master sketches a circle. He explains how stars rise earlier in the east because the earth curves. Students nod. It was not an argument to be won or lost. It was everyday knowledge. They did not need Columbus to prove what careful observation already showed. The circle of Earth was not radical, it was routine. Yet the flat Earth myth clings on because it is dramatic. Columbus appears heroic, the age of discovery looks sharper, and medieval folk seem like shadows from a child's play. In truth, Columbus did not prove the planet round. He gambled on its size, misjudged the distance, and reached islands he did not expect. That story is less clean, but far more interesting. The danger of these myths is clear. They let us dismiss the past instead of learning from it. For centuries, well-educated people observed, tested, and recorded the world. Their work survives in manuscripts, in diagrams, in figures that hold up under modern scrutiny. Reducing them to flat Earth fools damages our understanding of both their world and our own. If you close your eyes and picture sailors trembling at the thought of dropping into nothingness, remember this. That picture belongs to later painters and writers, not to them. Their fears were storms and starvation, not cosmic cliffs. The flat horizon carried enough weight on its own. What matters is this. The medieval world already knew the Earth was round. Columbus did not rescue them from ignorance. He gambled on a globe whose shape was never in doubt. The myth was written later to make the story sharper at the cost of truth. Once you see that, the edges blur in a different way. So the question shifts. If they already knew the world was round, what other familiar errors about the Middle Ages are still shaping how we imagine them today? The answer waits with another figure you think you know well. Picture the Viking you already know, the broad frame, axe raised high, and a helmet crowned with heavy horns. The image feels so natural that you almost expect archaeologists to have unearthed one just like it from a grave. But when spades turn earth in Scandinavian burial mounds, the helmets found are simple, practical, and unadorned. There are no horns. The famous silhouette belongs not to the Vikings themselves, but to the painted backdrops and costume stagings of the 19th century. Archaeologists have excavated many Viking burial sites, discovering swords, shields, jewellery, ships, and armour. Helmets appear only rarely, because iron was precious and often reused. Yet of the few helmets that survive, none carry horns. They are conical or rounded, reinforced with ridges or nose guards, helmets meant for war, not theatre. The horned helm, so familiar to us now, has no basis in Viking graves. Instead, it owes its popularity to 19th century opera stages, especially Carl Emil Doppler's costumes for Wagner's Ring Cycle, which fixed the horned helmet in the public imagination. And there is a reason horns never belonged in real battle. A helmet had one job: protect the head. Smooth metal turned blades, deflected arrows, spared bone. Adding antler-like pieces would only create handholds and snags. Horns were liabilities, as awkward in a shield wall as they would be under a ship's rigging. You would not survive a clash with decorations that made you a target. Still, the story is not as simple as saying horns were never used at all. They did exist in earlier Germanic and Bronze Age cultures, but there they were ritual headpieces, not battlefield equipment. Some ceremonial or tournament armours centuries later even borrowed extravagant forms to impress spectators. But those ornate helmets were theatrical gestures, never the gear of Viking raiders storming a coast. Folding those rare, ceremonial items into Viking imagery is like confusing a crown with a soldier's helmet. It mistakes performance for survival. The question then is, how did the horn attach itself so tightly to the Viking name? The answer lies in performance. 19th century Europe became fascinated with a romantic, fearsome vision of the North. Opera houses wanted their heroes and villains to look larger than life. Designers found that horns instantly read as wild, dangerous, barbaric to audiences. When Wagner's operas were staged with Doppler's costumes, horns perched tall on towering helmets. The effect was unforgettable. Posters and illustrations spread it further. From there it took root in art, literature, and eventually film, until the staged prop began to masquerade as historical truth. The force of the image is undeniable. You can test it yourself. Ask a child to draw a Viking, and curved horns sprout on the page almost without thought. Costume shops, sports mascots, and carnival floats cling to the shape. Though false, repetition has taught us to accept it as fact. Just as the Iron Maiden became a fixture in museums despite being a 19th century fabrication, the horned helmet became a fixture in cultural memory, surviving precisely because it looks striking. Meanwhile, the real helmets tell another story. Picture a Viking sailor on the open sea, wind hard against the sail, rain breaking across the deck. His helmet fits close, riveted metal pressed firmly at brow and cheek. It has no horns to knock him off balance. It is practical, built for staying alive. In his other hand rests a shield, wood and iron. In his belt, a weapon. Everything serves function, not spectacle. But myths endure because they serve emotional needs. Horns make Vikings into monsters, creatures of menace pouring from fog. Without them, we confront human beings. Brutal, ambitious, adventurous men, but still men. To strip away the horns strips away the flourish of legend, and legend is always harder to surrender than truth. Museums know this struggle well. Behind the glass you see a damaged iron circlet, plain in its lines, maybe a nose guard still intact. A placard names it a Viking helmet. Then, in a gift shop or poster down the hall, you find the horned figure staring back at you. Both versions stand side by side, one true and one invented, both claiming your memory. Too often, the false one wins, because it is more colourful. Still, there is an irony here. The sagas, the poetry, the chronicles, these do not mention horns at all. They celebrate voyages, raids, feuds, and honour codes. Nowhere do they pause to admire a fearsome horned helm. The silence in the texts echoes the silence in the graves. Together they testify to what's missing. Horns belong to theatre, not to their world. Even so, culture continues to retrofit the past for spectacle. Designers, artists, filmmakers add horns to make Vikings look dangerous. The stage prop casts its shadow forward, covering the plain iron truth. The audience prefers the mask, but that preference comes at a cost. It reduces history into caricature and blurs the humanity of people who once lived. The correction is simple enough. No horned helmet has ever been uncovered in a Viking battlefield or grave. The ones you picture were imagined for opera and spectacle, not war. If horns once touched northerners' brows in ritual centuries before, they did not sail with raiders or clash in shield walls. The figure we accepted, towering and cruel, is a child of performance, not archaeology. Recognizing this matters, because the same pattern repeats elsewhere. One striking but false image buries the quieter truths. One device of theatre shapes centuries of belief, and time and again, the Middle Ages are retold as darker, stranger, more grotesque than they were. The Viking horns are just one mask among many, and when the mask falls, we must ask once more, if we mispicture even the helmets, what else in the medieval world has been painted in dirt and shadow that does not belong there? Imagine the picture most of us were handed in school, a medieval villager trudging through mud, cloak in tatters, hair greasy, skin caked with dirt. You can almost smell the stench, the sour weight of sweat and grime clinging over years. The story insists people never washed, that they lived their lives under a permanent crust of filth. But the truth is far less bleak. The idea that the Middle Ages were an age of unrelieved stink was painted later, not lived then. Think of water in a medieval town. It was not absent nor ignored. Pipes carried it into courtyards, fountains stood in squares, and wells lined the streets. In places like Paris, records show more than 30 public bathhouses by the 13th century, signalling how ordinary bathing was for city dwellers. Washing was a daily encounter, hands rinsed at fountains, faces splashed after the market, buckets hauled at dawn. Families lacked private bathrooms, but they were not strangers to regular washing. Step into a home. Before meals, you were expected to wash your hands. Water flowed into basins, cloths waiting nearby. To skip that act was seen as rude, even suspicious. Cleanliness wrapped itself around social honour. The dirty face or oily hands at the table spoke of carelessness, just as an unpolished shoe might today. Books of manners and sermons reminded listeners that bad smells betrayed bad order, that a neighbour who reeked could be judged for neglecting both body and soul. It was not purity in our modern sense, but it was deep enough to shape reputation. Public bathhouses gave it a more communal form. Imagine steam drifting into alleys, conversations rising behind thin walls, bodies soaked and scrubbed as warm water bathed skin. These were not rare occasions. Bathhouses dotted towns across Europe, large and small, used by men and women, the rich and many of the poor. Paris had dozens at its peak, Cologne still more, and monasteries kept their own baths for the upkeep of monks. To bathe was normal, expected, part of civic rhythm. The picture of the unwashed peasant collapses as soon as you recall whole neighbourhoods scented by boiling water and herbs. Of course, the system was not perfect. Epidemics introduced fear. During the Black Death, some bathhouses closed as people worried steam might spread illness. In years of hardship, bathing might shrink to simple rinsing in cold water, wiping with linen, or rubbing down with herbs. Still, the intention to keep clean remained. Poverty and crisis shaped how often, but rarely eliminated the effort. Clothing carried as much weight as washing. Beneath woolen cloaks, fresh linen rested against most bodies. Linen was prized because it absorbed sweat and could be laundered often. Washerwomen bent over streams and tubs, scrubbing and wringing until their hands were raw. For families, changing into clean linen was a small renewal, a reset of dignity. That contrasts sharply with the myth of villagers wearing the same. Rotting rags for years, dirt was worked against, actively, not shrugged off. Scents added another layer. Herbs like rosemary, lavender and sage were common both in washwater and tied in sprigs to belt or garment. After a bath, oils were rubbed into skin, not for vanity alone, but to stave off dryness. Even monasteries codified washing routines, sometimes with strict rules about when and how water should be used. Clean bodies were healthier, easier to manage in close quarters, and less offensive. What lingered in the air mattered. So why do we imagine the opposite? Much of it is later propaganda. Renaissance and Enlightenment thinkers looked back at the centuries before them and painted a dark landscape to flatter their own progress. In that landscape, peasants were imagined as mud creatures, nobles as indifferent to stench, towns as swamps of rot. The myth drew strength precisely because it contrasted so brutally with the storytellers present. It became a way of saying, we are better now, they were backward then. Even so, hygiene was not uniform. Open drains cut through many streets. Pigs and dogs scattered refuse in markets. The air of a city could be foul. No one would mistake it for sterile, but people did not simply bathe in the dirt. They pushed back, laundering, scrubbing, bathing, perfuming when possible. These were not luxuries ignored, but everyday acts carried out within the limits of place and means. Re-imagine that peasant once more, not the caricatured mud figure, but a person with linen rinsed at the stream, hair wetted from a bucket, hands washed before taking bread. Herbs hang from a belt, clothes dry near the fire after laundering, boots still grind into mud, but dignity sits close at hand. This vision is harder to dramatize than eternal filth, but it rests more closely on the evidence we have. The myth thrives because dirt is an easy insult. It makes the past seem alien, brutish, something from which progress saved us. But life then was no simple parade of stink. It was layered, sometimes foul, often cared for, never ignored entirely. People valued their bodies too much to let grime win without contest. What survives, once the exaggeration fades, is quieter and more human. They washed hands in fountains, bathed in steam-filled rooms, wore clean linen, fought smells with herbs, and tied small acts of hygiene to respect and honour. Cleanliness was built into the texture of their days, and even written into the rules of their monasteries. The world was not spotless, but it was far cleaner than the crude myth allows. Steam rising from the bathhouse, damp linen strung by the hearth, a sprig of rosemary at the belt. Those were the scents and textures of their real lives, details that carried dignity even in struggle. And yet, just as with hygiene, there is another familiar claim that falters when you hold it up to the past. You have probably heard it before, that medieval people had no safe water at all. It is easy to imagine a world where every sip was beer or wine, but the story of medieval people avoiding water altogether is one of those myths that clings because it makes a neat picture. In reality, beer appeared regularly, but water was fetched daily. It filled pots, cooled brows, rinsed food, and was drunk wherever it was safe. The bucket and the well mattered just as much as the jug and the barrel. Picture a morning in any ordinary household. A woman steps outside, lowers a rope, and hauls up her bucket. The wood creaks, the rope strains, and what rises is not poison, but life itself. That water goes into the stew pot, onto the bread dough, across the face of a child. It soaks cloths for cleaning and keeps herbs alive in the corner of the garden. beer and wine may have been valued in their turn, but water ran through the rhythm of every day. The popular myth endures largely because it makes the past look foolish. It gives us an image of whole villages staggering around with mugs in hand, children raised on ale instead of milk, as though the entire Middle Ages swirled in drink. The evidence tells us otherwise. In city records, in monastic accounts, in disputes heard in court, water appears again and again, measured, protected, and regulated. Rights to springs and conduits were worth defending. No one would defend what they scorned as deadly. And practical systems made this possible. Town builders drew from high-ground springs, carrying clean water down into streets. Wells were sunk deep to escape surface rot. Monasteries designed careful channels to keep water running inside cloisters. In London, by the mid-13th century, a major project created the Great Conduit, an underground system that moved fresh water from Tyburn into the heart of the city. So citizens had something safer than a river near the tanners' vats. Treating water wisely was effortful, but it mattered enough that they built infrastructure to guard it. That does not make beer a stranger. It held an honoured place, brewed strong for festival or lighter for daily use. What we often forget is that much of it was small beer, brewed weak with low alcohol, more like flavoured liquid bread than anything that would topple a man after 2 cups. It could store more safely than water in some situations, and so families brewed and drank it for its mildness. But brewing was resource-intensive. Grain had to be harvested, malted, dried, and burned in fires that cost wood. To supply every sip that way would drain a household's resources too quickly. Beer was there, but it was not the only drink. Wine followed a similar pattern. In regions where vines flourished, wine was pressed and cellared, sipped at table or consecrated at altar. But even in these places, wells within monasteries and fountains on town corners still mattered. Monasteries recorded both side by side, casks of wine aging underground and wells listed in accounts, with servants assigned to maintain them, if wine had replaced water entirely such. Coexistence would vanish. Instead we find evidence of both, intertwined. The countryside tells the story as clearly as the city. A shepherd in the field could not rely on barrels. He filled a flask from his home well and drank it beneath the sun. A ploughman guiding oxen reached to a jug of water from the stream where it was clear. Brewing had its place, but routine outdoor labour demanded proximity, and water was always closest to hand. And there was the simple economics. In years when grain grew short, brewing at the expense of bread was unthinkable. A family missing bread risked hunger. Water from the well never ran short in that way. Inside monasteries, documents confirm how drinking worked. At mealtimes, pitchers might hold beer or wine, but often they held water drawn fresh from cloister fountains. Monastic rules often made the distinction clear. Beer or wine for special feast, water for ordinary order. The monks lived by rhythm, and water kept them inside that rhythm. The myth survives today because it brightens stories. It makes the past colourful, even comic. But real life required constant care over water, choosing which source to fetch from, learning which well ran deep enough to avoid waste, recognising which stream was foul and which could be trusted. Like us, people distinguished between clean and dirty, used what was safe and avoided what was not. To blur that into a drunken haze is to dismiss their intelligence. Think again on the small details. Fingers knotted around a rough hemp rope, muscles pulling the weight of water up from the cool dark. The bucket kisses the ground, spilling a little onto the soil before being carried inside. That effort repeated day after day tells you what water meant. It created work no one would bear unless the water was vital. No one hauls poison with pride each morning. Beer and wine still mattered. Taverns rang with noise, workers sometimes received mugs as part of wages, and feast days overflowed with drink. But that was the layer of celebration and relief, not the base required for life. To say that all ordinary hydration came from barrels collapses under its own weight. Too much grain, too much cost, too much impracticality. Water stood at the centre. The evidence is steady. Wells, conduits, rivers, fountains, all used with care and judgment. Brewing stood beside them as supplement, pleasure, mild relief, or trade good. And so, the neat picture of a beer-only world fades away, replaced by a more complex truth of balance and labour. So next time you hear the rustic joke that peasants lived on ale alone, pause and imagine instead the shimmer of a fountain in a square, the rope creak over a village well, the basin of water ladled before bread touched lips. The myth is strong, but the truth drawn from the bucket is stronger still, and just as with water, so with knowledge. Where we expect folly, the record reveals careful effort. Where legend tells us of nonsense, the evidence shows serious purpose, and that is where we turn next. Imagine a dim hall lit by oil lamps, the air sharp with ink and wax. Rows of scholars bend over their desks, and you can almost hear the scrape of quills mingling with whispered debate. But into this quiet space, centuries of mockery have thrust a single image. Monks debating the most absurd of puzzles. How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? It has become shorthand for futility, a cartoon of wasted intellect. Yet like so many visions pinned to the medieval past, it is not what the records reveal. The phrase itself does not appear in medieval manuscripts. No lecture notes, disputations, or treatises present that precise question. The familiar image is a later invention, a joke first appearing in the 17th century, long after the medieval schools had closed their doors for the night. Writers eager to satirize scholastic theology conjured it as a way to ridicule academic inquiry, a quick line that made centuries of intellectual culture look pointless in an instant. When repeated, the story is effective because it reduces everything into absurdity. The auditorium of law and logic collapses into a comedy sketch. Eminent theologians become fools arguing over celestial dancers balanced on metal needles. We laugh because the image is simple. We forget to ask whether it was ever posed at all, and so the myth thrives, detached from history yet still shaping how people imagine it. If we step aside from the caricature, the actual debates surviving in the record are nothing like that pin. Questions survive in commentaries, glosses, and student notes. How should conflicting witness testimonies be weighed in court? What is the moral weight of intention when judging sinful acts? How does the soul connect to the body's sickness and healing? These are substantive, sometimes strange, but never empty. They aimed at law, ethics, and nature, issues that pressed close on daily life. Yet the appeal of the pin image runs deeper. It offers a certainty. Look at those men. We're invited to say they wasted time. Their questions were fanciful, their answers irrelevant. But their actual labour shows a different picture. The method of disputation demanded precision. Arguments were set, counter-arguments explored, conclusions drawn. It was training, not idleness. A legal judgment, a sermon or a civic ruling could flow directly from this discipline. Even their strangest inquiries had a structure. They asked about the properties of angels, but as a way to define motion space or causality. These were frameworks for questions, not games. It is easy for us to dismiss speculation on the spiritual heavens, but within their world such debates were rooted in serious study. They were exercises in how invisible truths might reveal earthly order. None of it resembles the cartoon of counting angels balancing on a needle's point. The real origin of the pin myth lies in satire. Early modern writers who looked back were eager to contrast their rational age with medieval nonsense. By fabricating an image of monks fussing over angels condensed into absurdities, they could dismiss centuries of genuine intellectual work. It was a rhetorical weapon, simple and devastating, but a weapon made for derision is not a window into the past. Why then does it endure so strongly? Because it condenses centuries of scholastic learning into a single punchline. Remembering the arguments on law, justice and causality takes effort. Recalling the silly picture of angels dancing on a pinhead is effortless. The myth succeeds because it flatters us, telling us we are smarter now, while making the medieval mind a subject for ridicule. Like tales of flat earth fear or horned helmets, it thrives precisely because it is vivid, not because it is true. Imagine yourself in those halls again. A student stands, states a thesis, that two contracts made at the same time but with conflicting promises must be judged by priority of intent. Another rises, objects. The master interrupts, points to flaws of logic, suggests a resolution. This is not trivial play. It is practice in discipline. It is how jurists, preachers, and administrators learn to think. To call that process futile because of a later joke is to take centuries of training and dismiss them with a sneer. Now consider the larger pattern. We see again the habit of later centuries recasting the Middle Ages as foolish, dirty, or cruel. Just as they imagined torture machines that never existed and peasants too ignorant to know the earth was round, they conjured pin, dancing angels to show scholastics as clowns. You might chuckle at the story, but beneath it rests a deliberate act of belittling. That does not mean their studies were familiar to us. Some questions appear strange, even alien. They spoke of souls, of divine order, of heavenly beings whose actions shaped earthly causality. But strangeness is not silliness. What they built was coherent in its own terms. It guided judgment, speech, law, and conscience. It gave communities frames of meaning. This is far removed from empty theatre. Think of the Pin story as a mask. It hides the true face of earnest men struggling for clarity. Behind that mask we find writers willing to stretch thought, to define, to categorize, to test. Whatever their assumptions, their seriousness is unmistakable. To strip it away is to see people searching for order, not jesters performing nonsense. So the correction matters. No medieval text has been found that poses the famous question. The phrasing was satire created centuries later. The scholars of the 13th century did not weigh angels on pinheads, but they did weigh contracts, intentions, and laws of nature. Their world was rigorous, reflective, and saturated with questions they thought vital. That is the truth that the joke was designed to erase. And in remembering that, something shifts. The false comedy falls silent. We leave not theologians chattering about angels on metal points, but groups bent over parchment, minds intent on law, ethics, causality, and divine order. Their pens scratch toward clarity, not nonsense. We may not share their conclusions, but we can still recognise their discipline, and this in turn sets the stage for our next figure. For mocking caricatures were not confined to scholars with pens. Another image, equally polished and equally misleading, waits ahead. The shining silhouette of a warrior whose story gleams brighter in legend than it ever did in life. Imagine the knight in armour, steel flashing in the sun, horse glinting with tack, sword raised as if to guard the weak. It is a figure we recognise instantly, noble and almost saintly. In storybooks and films alike, he appears as the pure guardian of justice, gallant and flawless. This is the myth of the knight in shining armour, shaped by chivalry's legend. But as with other illusions tied to the Middle Ages, the polished surface hides what was rougher beneath. Knights were, above all, fighters. They were armed horsemen trained for war, often hired or bound by contract, tied by obligations of coin or feudal duty. Many acted in the service of lords, shifting between campaigns, quarrels, or local disputes. Their world was transactional in part, but it would be too simple to claim they were nothing but mercenaries. For alongside violence stood the evolving idea of chivalry, a code promoted by poets, churchmen, and chroniclers to frame how knights ought to act. Even if reality often strayed, this idea of chivalry was never static or universal. It changed over centuries, varied by region, and was less a description of what knights always did than a guide for what others hoped they would do. Clerics and rulers used it as a way of regulating trained fighters whose power could be as dangerous to neighbours as it was useful in defence. The Peace of God and Truce of God movements, for example, attempted to restrict fighting to certain times, offering an ideal of restraint. Chivalry was not an iron law, but an aspiration, and often an attempt to redeem or redirect knightly violence. So the contradiction appears clearly. On one hand, knights could be quarrelsome, brutal, sometimes predatory. They taxed peasants, raided travellers, and settled disputes with blades. On the other hand, literature spoke of gentleness, mercy, and the defence of the poor. The gap between ink and iron is wide. On parchment they embodied gallantry, while in the fields they left scars. The code tried to pull the warrior's image toward light, even if mud clung stubbornly to his boots. That does not mean chivalry was meaningless. It mattered because reputation mattered. A knight who hoped to rise in standing or memory could not ignore the ideals voiced by poets or preached by clerics. He might indeed give alms, sponsor the building of a chapel, or restrain excess when he knew a chronicler's eye was near. In those moments, chivalry had teeth. But often, it acted like a cloak, smoothing over violence with ornament, more like public relations than binding rule. Now picture a tournament. Flags stream, trumpets bray, a crowd claps as lances meet. Armour shines brighter than in war, built heavier for spectacle, designed to impress the noble eyes who came to watch. This was part sport, part theatre. Afterward, though, the same men might ride into skirmishes or torch villages. The transition from showground to battlefield was swift. One armour was built to dazzle, the other for endurance. And yet, in memory and art, it was the gleam of display that stuck. Literature carried much of the weight. Romances of knights in quests, rescuing damsels, defeating monsters, cast the warrior into legend. Adults knew such tales were exaggerated, but they provided a model of conduct, however distant from reality. Over time, these stories reshape truth itself, so that when we picture knights now, we often remember the fictions more vividly than the facts. The Church gave this current added force. Keen to discipline armed men, it wrapped their vocation in liturgy. Knights became soldiers of Christ in sermons, their violence sanctified when pointed outward. Protecting widows and orphans was made an article of holy duty. Such commands made sense only because knights often failed them. The repetition of restraint reveals the need. Violence was always easier to sustain than mercy. Consider how this appeared to ordinary people. Farmers burdened by levies to pay for campaigns. Merchants halted and stripped of goods by roving men-at-arms. Villages caught between feuds, forced to give animals as supplies. For such lives, the knight could feel more like predator than saviour. The code claimed protection of the weak. Daily reality often delivered the opposite. Still, chivalry was more than theatre. Some knights wrote treatises of their own, reflecting on ideals of conduct. Others genuinely attempted to square violence with service. It was inconsistent, often contradicted, but it shaped how men thought of themselves. To imagine knights as merely thugs misses that the idea of honour did sometimes restrain them. But to imagine them as paragons of virtue is even further from the truth. Now strip away the fluttering banners and think of armour itself. What survives in art is pristine, gleaming, composed like a saint in steel. What lived on campaign was dented, muddied, patched after battle. Armour was heavy, the wearing of it exhausting and its upkeep costly. Knights in war looked more like weary soldiers than fairy tale guardians. The shining figure is a cleaned image, memory scrubbed until it blinded with light. The lesson is balance. Knighthood combined brutality with aspiration, coin with code, spectacle with duty. Chivalry was not a universal reality, but an evolving system of ideals, a framework that could sometimes tug men toward better acts, sometimes falter entirely. It was more guidance than truth, more performance than practice, more polish than core. Understanding this prevents us from taking the radiant image as a mirror of everyday life. Later centuries added further polish. Novelists in the Romantic Age lifted the knight into myth, smoothing over raids and taxes while celebrating rescues and virtues. What survived was the fairy tale, the steel-clad hero standing spotless before the world. It is an alluring vision, but one spun far more in salons and stories than on muddy ground. So what matters is remembering the tension. Knights were trained fighters first. Their codes were layered on top, sometimes effective, sometimes ignored, always contested. To believe only in their gallantry is to accept a mask rather than meet the man within. Beneath the shining image, there were contracts, lords to serve, villages to tax, battles to fight. They were soldiers before they were symbols. And once you see that armour as less than perfect, another question rises. Because if the knight we imagine is shaped more by story than by truth, then so too might be the crowds we picture in the shadows of firelight, raising their voices not in honour but in accusation. Imagine a night sky lit not by stars but by fire. The picture most often carried is of crowds gathered, women tied to stakes, flames rising high, while a mob watches in triumph. We're told again and again this was medieval Europe in action, an age defined by witch burnings. But that image does not belong to the Middle Ages. The widespread witch hunts that most people imagine, the frenzies of fire, thousands accused in fevered trials, largely belong to the early modern period, from the 16th to 18th centuries. That is when printed pamphlets stirred fear, rulers used panic to enforce authority, and mass burnings swept across regions. In the medieval centuries before, suspicion of magic existed, but executions for witchcraft were rare. Trials happened here or there, but nothing like the continent-wide hunts that would come later. When you step back, the difference is striking. In the Middle Ages, witchcraft accusations were usually treated as superstition or small-scale trickery. Someone might be accused of causing illness by charms, of muttering curses, or of fortune-telling. These offences were real enough in medieval eyes, but punishments were more likely to be fines, public penance, or lighter sentences. Death at the stake was far from the norm. This is not guesswork. Medieval law codes and councils sometimes explicitly resisted the killing of accused witches. Early Lombard law treated harmful magic as a crime, but not one that deserved burning. Some church councils warned that to execute supposed witches was itself sinful, because such killings often sprang from superstition, not reason. These official cautions stand as evidence. Authority in the Middle Ages often worked to suppress hysteria rather than fuel it. That stands in sharp contrast with what came later. In the 16th and 17th centuries, new theological writings reframed witchcraft as a demonic pact. Pamphlets spread vivid tales of sabbats, flying broomsticks, and orgies with the devil. Courts ruled on mass trials. Villages saw neighbour turn on neighbour in fear. It was then, not in the 13th or 14th centuries, that fire consumed thousands across Europe. The so-called epidemic of witch-burning erupted after the medieval period had already ended. Still, the vision of medieval mobs lighting pyres fits too well into the stereotype of the Dark Ages. If you want to paint the past as ignorant and cruel, what better shorthand than firewood piled beneath a bound woman? The myth is vivid, but vividness is not proof. Think of medieval superstition more as smoke than flame. People did believe in charms and curses. They whispered about the evil eye. They pinned misfortune on neighbours, but these fears flickered on the edges of life, handled with suspicion, gossip and community shaming more than with the axe or the pyre. Local remedies and folk magic mingled with church ritual. Priests might scold or punish such acts, but often as minor sin, not cosmic treachery. Harsh, yes, but not a campaign of extermination. There were darker exceptions. Sorcery tied to poisoning or weather manipulation sometimes sparked genuine anxiety. A handful of people did suffer execution, but these moments remained scattered and inconsistent, rather than forming an organised purge. To medieval people, far greater fears pressed in: famine, plague, war and heresy. Compared to these, witches were background noise. So where did the myth take shape? Much of it was written backward. As hysteria spread in the 16th and 17th centuries, Protestants and Catholics alike sought to emphasise their own vigilance. They presented witchcraft as a timeless danger. In doing so, they projected their panic back into medieval centuries, rewriting the earlier Middle Ages as if those times too had seethed with pyres and witch hunts. Later writers and educators spread that retroactive image, and it stuck. Imagine instead a medieval town square, not filled with flames, but with merchants bickering over prices, guilds organising festivals, priests warning against heresy, and peasants worrying over failing crops. Witchcraft accusations did occur, but they were one concern among many, insignificant compared to the Black Death, compared to hunger, compared to lords demanding taxes. To say witches defined medieval fear is to miss what truly weighed on medieval lives. There is an irony in how history unfolded. Medieval Europe, harsh as it could be, rarely pursued witches with mass executions. Yet in the early modern age, an era that prided itself on reason and order, the real hunts flared. Thousands suffered as communities scapegoated misfortune onto women accused of pacts with Satan. The violence we often assign to the age of superstition was in fact sharpened by later ambition to control chaos through spectacle. Think of the difference as a candle beside a roaring bonfire. In medieval centuries, suspicion of witchcraft flickered, uneven and dim. In the early modern world, fueled by pamphlets and courts, it blazed. Memory has since blurred the two, and the glow of later fires has been projected backward. That projection is the myth. The myth endures because it offers a dramatic story. It gives modern audiences horror scenes of medieval crowds gone mad, when in truth, most of those crowds were dealing with hunger, taxes, and grief. By keeping the later frenzy glued onto the medieval frame, we simplify the past into a cartoon and rob it of its complexity. Picture instead a woman in the 14th century. She hangs charms by her door, mutters a prayer for protection, and worries more about harvest than about accusations. Her neighbours may laugh or scold, perhaps accuse her of mischief if livestock sicken. More often than not, it ends there. No stake, no immense crowd, no flames tearing into the night. Real fears pressed closer, more immediate, less theatrical. To say medieval Europe lived on witch burnings is to confuse centuries. Witchcraft then was a suspicion, often treated as folly or small sin. The grand frenzy, the show trials, the pamphlets, the crowds whipped into terror came later. That difference matters because without it, we miss how myths are built. When you hear that the Middle Ages were defined by witch hunts, remember instead the silence in most records, the councils that warned against bloodshed, the lighter punishments handed down more often than death. In that silence lies testimony, telling us witch hysteria grew monstrous only after the medieval centuries had passed. The persistence of the myth reminds us of a theme we have seen again and again. Later, storytelling reshaping memory to make the past look darker than it was. In the case of witches, 16th and 17th century panic was projected backward until it coated the centuries before. The image of endless medieval pyres is not history. It is hindsight painted in fire. And once you recognise how even burning pyres can be misplaced in time, it prepares you for another illusion. Because sometimes the very stones we think of as medieval, great castles rising proud against the sky, turn out not to belong to the Middle Ages at all. Picture a castle gleaming against the mountains, white walls catching the light, slender towers rising skyward like something drawn out of a dream. You know this shape already. It appears on calendars, postcards, puzzles, even cartoons. Tourists climb steep paths to reach its gates and whisper, as though standing before the very essence of medieval Europe. The name may shift, but the image remains fixed. Neuschwanstein, the world's most famous medieval castle. Step closer in your imagination. You see sculpted balconies, rows of pointed windows and turrets that climb almost impossibly above the tree line. Every detail suggests knights and banners, feasts and sieges. To many visitors, it defines what the Middle Ages look like. Yet here is the turn. Neuschwanstein is not medieval at all. Its story begins 7 centuries later. Construction started in 1869, deep in the 19th century, an age of railways, telegraphs and factories. The blocks were not raised by masons with chisels lit by oil lamps, but by workers using industrial tools and modern methods. It is not a fortress. It is a fantasy carved into stone. The difference matters. Real medieval castles were rough, defensive structures that smelled of smoke and sweat. Their walls patched from siege damage, their rooms crowded with servants and soldiers. By contrast, Neuschwanstein's walls were raised for beauty, not battle. It has no angled arrow slits or cannon-resistant bastions. It is all ornament and atmosphere. Designed during the Romantic movement, it was an intentional reimagining, shaped to mimic medieval architecture while smoothing away its harshness. What looks authentic is, in truth, scenery. Step inside and the illusion becomes clearer. Instead of damp passages and sooty kitchens, you find grand chambers adorned with murals of myth and legend. Bright chandeliers hang above polished floors, heating systems and plumbing hide behind stone. It feels medieval only in costume. Everything beneath the surface speaks of its modern birth, comfort disguised as chivalric dream. Set this against the genuine castles of the Middle Ages. Those were blunt instruments of rule, homes, prisons and garrisons all at once. Their interiors were dark, their stairways narrow, their floors strewn with rushes that soaked up dirt. A garrison drilled in the yard. Smoke clung to rafters. A lord entertained, yes, but he also stockpiled grain against famine and fortified walls against war. Function defined form. Neuschwanstein reverses that order. It is functionless defence wrapped in ornamental splendour, and yet its power is undeniable. The 19th century was hungry for an imagined past, a time of noble warriors and graceful ladies. Neuschwanstein was built to satisfy that hunger, to conjure a purified Middle Ages stripped of grime and brutality. In that sense, it becomes less a castle than a mirror, reflecting what later centuries wished history had been. Visitors step into its halls and feel wonder, not because it is truly medieval, but because it looks the way later generations believed the medieval world should look. The reach of this fantasy is vast. Open any illustrated storybook for children, and you are likely to see turrets modelled after Neuschwanstein. Theme parks have borrowed its exact silhouette, selling the fantasy as a centerpiece. Films use it as shorthand. the castle that announces the Middle Ages without a word. Over time, this imitation has displaced the originals in memory. Tourists may see ruined strongholds across Europe, but the pristine image still dominates imagination. Think of how that distorts our picture of history. We imagine knights returning to towers they never knew, troubadours serenading balconies not yet invented, banners fluttering against stone that hadn't been laid. Neuschwanstein has rewritten memory so completely that the wrong building has become the stage set for centuries of medieval life, and it sits alongside a quiet irony. Europe is filled with genuine medieval castles of every scale. Hilltop strongholds, riverside keeps, palace, fortresses. Their remains endure, battered by weather and history. Yet the castle most closely tied to the Middle Ages in popular imagination was completed at a time when smokestacks were already rising over cities. Authentic ruins lie forgotten, while this 19th century dream defines the entire word castle for millions. Stand among the visitors on its approach. The forest opens, clouds drift close, and the white facade gleams above. Phones come out, shutters snap. People speak of finally seeing the Middle Ages. But what they see is not the 13th century carried forward. It is the 19th century dressed in costume. They photograph a romance more than a reality. Still, its influence is lasting. Neuschwanstein has shown that a powerful image can overshadow the truth. Its walls prove how strongly we cling to invention when it suits what we wish the past had been. It is the castle that looks too perfect, chiselled not by medieval necessity but by modern longing. Behind polished towers lies a fact. The Middle Ages were ruled from grim, functional fortresses where walls bore scars of siege and halls clattered with work. To forget that, in favour of Neuschwanstein's dream, is to trade hard stone for myth. But myths have weight. They shape what we think history looked like and, more importantly, what it felt like. And here the pattern continues. We have seen how spikes, horns, angels, witches and castles have all shifted shape under the pressure of the later storytelling. Each time the invention becomes more vivid than the truth. Each time we are left asking what else has been disguised by the gloss of myth. Because just as walls and towers have been rebuilt in imagination, so too have numbers. There is another claim you may know well, repeated often, stated with certainty, that medieval people barely lived beyond 30 years. The number sounds precise, the picture it paints is stark, but it is as misleading as the castle that gleams too perfectly in stone. You've likely heard it before, as if it were an unshakable fact, that medieval people rarely lived beyond 30 years. The phrase echoes like a sentence handed down, a single number meant to define an entire age. It conjures images of villagers stooped and ancient at 30, crumbling before their lives had truly unfolded. That neat claim is persuasive. It is also misleading. What matters first is understanding what that number actually represents. The average life expectancy of around 30 to 35 years is an average at birth. It is hauled downward by the sheer weight of infant and child deaths. In a world where sickness, famine and accidents claimed many children before they could even walk or speak, the calculation bends sharply. The average collapses because so many never survived those perilous early years. But for those who did, the story shifts. A child who reached 12, or a youth who stepped into the hard work of adulthood, had every chance of living far beyond that average. Records and remains show people not merely lasting into their 30s, but reaching into their 60s and 70s. Aristocrats, monks and ordinary townsfolk all left traces of long lives. Scars healed over, joints worn by decades of labour, teeth ground down by years of use. 30 was not the end. More often, it was the threshold into mature life. Yet women face special risks. Childbirth in some periods placed women in greater danger than men, and that danger tilted averages lower for them. Death in labour sits quietly behind those misleading numbers. Still, many women did survive multiple births, raising children and grandchildren, their lives stretching long alongside the men of their families. Here again, averages obscure the lived variety of outcomes. Imagine a village square at dusk. A grey-haired elder leans on a staff, gathered with neighbours around a fire. Younger villagers listen, rapt, as he recounts famines endured, battles with weather, seasons of plenty, lessons won through survival. Scenes like this are echoed across records and memory. They are reminders that the presence of old age was not anomaly, but part of the fabric of life. The myth lingers because it is clean and dramatic. To say they only lived to 30 makes the past darker, poorer, more primitive than the present. It draws a sharp line of progress. Yet the lived reality resisted such finality. Farming contracts, apprenticeships, monastic vows, all show time measured in decades. Institutions expected people to endure, to build, to govern with continuity. That expectation rested on human lives that went beyond a narrow number. Church registers, charters, and inheritance records tell similar stories. Families counted on parents and grandparents when handing down land. Monks advanced through stages of age and responsibility. Villages looked to elders as memory keepers and arbitrators. These roles would not exist if most people stopped at 30. The systems themselves confirm survival into later life. The bones in churchyards add a human accent to this record. Archaeologists uncover skeletons scarred by arthritis, joints thickened by age, jaws missing teeth long lost in middle years. These are not traces of short, broken lives, but long ones, often shaped by hardship yet carried decades beyond the alleged limit. Evidence sits silent, but firm in the soil. That is not to say life was light or safe. The toll of infant mortality and childbirth risk was harsh. Epidemics could sweep towns in months, plagues cutting across all ages. But even under that shadow, families endured. Some individuals lived long enough to see children's grandchildren gather, to watch villages shift, to hear generations call them both witness and survivor. So why does the mistaken number grip us so tightly? Because it flatters progress. It tells us that only through medicine, sanitation, and modern science did humans learn to live fully. But the evidence proves otherwise. People of the Middle Ages lived shorter lives when cut down early, but when survival pushed past those first thresholds, age stretched on much as we might expect today. Picture again the rhythm of medieval existence. Apprenticeships lasting into middle age, soldiers fighting in multiple campaigns over decades, monks who rose from novices to abbots over a span that required 40 years. And in households, widows and widowers lived on, stewarding property, shaping family memory, teaching the young what struggle had taught them. These are not exceptions. They are what life needed to continue. The headline claim that they lived to 30 folds all this into a single flat figure. It denies the old voices heard at hearthfires and village councils. It erases the grandmothers who survived childbirth to become matriarchs. It hollows the record of men and women whose bent spines, worn bones, and etched wrinkles testify to 6 or 7 decades lived. Numbers tell one version, lives tell another. What you should remember is simple. The figure of 30 is an average at birth skewed by infant and child mortality. It does not mean adults dropped dead at 30. Those who passed the peril of early youth often lived into middle and old age, sometimes into their 70s. Women carried special risks from childbirth, but even then, many endured long enough to see generations grow beneath them. The lesson is not of uniformly short lives, but of life uncertain, varied, fragile, and at times very long. So the next time that number is repeated, pause. Averages can flatten complexity. The truth is more human. Some lives ended too early, others endured through decades, and their mingling is what built the medieval world. The claim of 30 years misleads because it strips away those contrasts, and as we leave this subject behind, the same question surfaces again. How many other fragments of the Middle Ages have been dressed in simple numbers or colourful images that won't survive the weight of evidence? When you picture medieval torture, one device almost always comes to mind: the Iron Maiden. A tall, coffin-like chamber lined with spikes on the inside, ready to close around a victim and pierce them from every direction. Museums have displayed them for centuries. Textbooks have described them as the ultimate symbol of medieval brutality. Movies and TV shows still use them to conjure the darkness of the Middle Ages. And yet, here is the truth. The Iron Maiden never actually existed in medieval times. The image of a prisoner locked into a spiked sarcophagus is terrifying. But when historians examined the evidence, they discovered something surprising. There are no medieval documents describing an Iron Maiden. No court records mention it. No chronicles tell of it being used. The first detailed references to the device appear not in the Middle Ages but in the 18th and 19th centuries, centuries after the medieval world had ended. So where did it come from? The story begins in Nuremberg, Germany in the early 1800s. A local antiquarian assembled a display for a museum of medieval history. He wanted visitors to gasp at the cruelty of the Dark Ages. To do this, he took an old storage cabinet, added spikes, and called it a medieval torture device. It was a spectacle designed to shock. From there, the idea spread rapidly. Writers, journalists, and early museum curators repeated the claim without questioning it. By the Victorian period, people were fascinated by lurid tales of medieval barbarity. They wanted to believe that their ancestors had lived in a brutal world, a contrast to what they thought of as their own more civilized age. The Iron Maiden fit that narrative perfectly. The truth, however, is more mundane. Medieval torture was real enough, but it did not involve elaborate machines like the Iron Maiden. Punishments were brutal but direct: whippings, mutilation, executions by hanging or burning. Interrogations relied on devices like the rack or the strappado, instruments we do have records of, but the spiked coffin belongs to a later age of imagination. In fact, scholars now recognise the Iron Maiden as a 19th century invention, created for shock value. Many of the examples shown in museums were cobbled together from older pieces, parts of Gothic armoires, iron hinges, even fragments of armour. They were never used to hold prisoners, they were built to hold the attention of paying audiences. Why did this matter so much to Victorians? Part of it was entertainment. Travelling shows and cabinet of curiosity exhibitions competed for attention. Displaying a terrifying torture device drew crowds. Another part was ideology. By portraying the Middle Ages as uniquely cruel, Victorians made their own time look enlightened. The Iron Maiden was propaganda as much as it was spectacle. Proof, they thought, that humanity had advanced. One of the most famous Iron Maidens is still displayed in Nuremberg. For years, guides told visitors it was an authentic medieval instrument of horror. But closer examination showed the iron plates dated to the 16th century, while the spikes and fittings were added only in the 18th or 19th. It was never used for torture in the way stories described. Other cities followed suit. London had one. Paris displayed another. Each was billed as authentic. Each drew gasps from audiences who were eager to believe the worst about the medieval world. And in doing so, the myth of the Iron Maiden became one of the most successful historical hoaxes of all time. The irony is that the Middle Ages didn't need exaggeration to seem harsh. Life was already difficult, justice already severe. Executions were public and often gruesome, designed to terrify onlookers. The pillory humiliated offenders. Thieves could lose hands, traitors could lose their heads. People lived with a daily awareness of punishment. Yet none of this included the Iron Maiden. That particular horror was the invention of later centuries, retroactively projected back onto the past. Today, historians see the Iron Maiden as a warning about how myths form. A single sensational display in one city became accepted truth across Europe and beyond. Textbooks repeated it. Tourists believed it. Even as scholars tried to correct the record, the image endured in popular culture. That's the power of a good story. It can outlast fact. But when we peel back the layers, the truth is more fascinating. Instead of being a symbol of medieval cruelty, the Iron Maiden is a symbol of Victorian imagination. It shows how one era created a fantasy version of another, using fear to entertain and moralise. In that sense, the Iron Maiden tells us less about the Middle Ages and more about the people who came after, eager to define themselves as modern by painting the past as monstrous. So the next time you see a picture of an Iron Maiden, or hear it described as a medieval torture device, remember, it never stood in a dungeon, it never held a prisoner, and it never dripped with blood. Its real story is not about spikes and suffering, but about how history can be distorted, reshaped, and sold to those who want to believe it. The Middle Ages had their horrors, but the Iron Maiden was not one of them. Walk into a European museum in the 1800s, and you might have seen rooms filled with spiked chairs, cruel-looking wheels, and ominous iron masks. Visitors were told these were authentic relics of medieval torture, devices used to punish heretics, thieves, and traitors. People gasped at the sight, horrified by the idea of an age so barbaric that it invented contraptions worthy of nightmares. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of those medieval torture devices were never medieval at all. They were products of a later industry, crafted in the 18th and 19th centuries to feed a growing appetite for horror. This fake brutality industry grew out of a mix of fascination and opportunism. By the early 1800s, the Middle Ages were already seen as a dark and mysterious era. Writers and historians described it as a time of ignorance, superstition, and cruelty. For Victorians, who prided themselves on progress and reason, the contrast made their own age seem enlightened. Museums, fairs, and private collectors quickly realised that people would pay to see physical proof of medieval savagery. If real artefacts were scarce, replicas, or outright inventions, would do just as well. One famous example was the so-called Judas cradle, a pyramidal seat on which victims were supposedly lowered to inflict agony. Another was the pear of anguish, a metal device shaped like a fruit that could be expanded inside a victim's mouth or body. These items were displayed as medieval instruments, their descriptions accompanied by lurid tales of torture. Yet careful research has shown that most of them only appear in catalogues or museum collections centuries later. Their designs owe more to the imaginations of craftsmen and entrepreneurs than to medieval justice. The Iron Maiden, of course, became the most famous of these creations, but it was only one of many. Spiked racks, elaborate masks, and so-called witch prickers were added to collections to satisfy the demand for shocking exhibits. Tourists visiting Nuremberg, London, or Paris could wander through galleries labelled Chambers of Horror, where curators promised glimpses into the cruelty of the past. In reality, the Middle Ages did not require such theatrical props to inspire fear. Punishments were harsh, but they were also simple. Hanging, burning, mutilation, and exile were all real and recorded. Interrogation could involve stretching on the rack or suspending a prisoner by their arms. These methods were brutal enough, but they did not involve the imaginative machines that later showmen claimed. Why then did 19th century people insist on inventing new ones? Part of the reason lies in their fascination with the Dark Ages. In the wake of the Enlightenment, the Middle Ages were portrayed as the opposite of everything modern society valued. By exaggerating medieval cruelty, Victorians could reassure themselves of their own progress. "Look how far we've come," the displays seemed to say. "Our ancestors were barbarians, but we are civilized." Another factor was economics. Travelling shows and curiosity cabinets made good money by shocking audiences. A simple set of stocks or a whip might not impress, but a spiked coffin or an iron mask guaranteed attention. Craftsmen in the 18th and 19th centuries manufactured these devices to meet demand, often aging the iron or wood to make them look ancient. Once placed in museums, they quickly gained the aura of authenticity. Tourist culture played its role too. As Europeans began travelling more widely, historical tourism flourished. Cities like Nuremberg, with their medieval architecture, capitalised on this trend. Visitors wanted not only castles and churches, but also stories of horror. Exhibiting authentic torture devices gave towns a way to market themselves as keepers of medieval history, even if that history was fabricated. The industry's influence reached far beyond museums. Writers, journalists, and educators repeated the claims, embedding the myths into textbooks and popular histories. By the late 19th century, school children were being taught about devices that had never existed in the Middle Ages. The line between fact and fiction blurred, and the myths hardened into accepted truth. The impact of this industry can still be felt today. Ask someone about medieval torture, and they may picture the Iron Maiden, the Pear of Anguish, or the spiked chair, none of which were genuine medieval practices. The real Middle Ages were violent enough, but their punishments were less theatrical and more pragmatic. They were designed to enforce order and display authority, not to provide elaborate spectacles of pain. Historians now look back at the fake brutality industry as an important lesson. It shows how easily the past can be distorted, not only by accident but by design. Inventions created for money, entertainment, or propaganda became part of the historical record because people wanted to believe them. They fit the narrative that the Middle Ages were dark, cruel, and barbaric, a narrative that made later centuries seem brighter by comparison. Peeling away these layers of myth does not erase the cruelty of the time. It simply helps us understand it more accurately. The Middle Ages were not populated by engineers of nightmare machines. They were lived by people who used the tools they had: whips, ropes, fire, and blades. Their justice was harsh, but it did not require the elaborate contraptions dreamed up centuries later. So when you see an iron chair bristling with spikes in a museum, or a pear of anguish displayed as medieval, remember, You may be looking not at history, but at invention. These objects are less windows into the Middle Ages than mirrors of the 19th century, reflecting a time when fear and fascination with the past could be turned into spectacle. The true brutality was simpler, more direct, and no less chilling for it. Tonight, we've walked among shadows, the Iron Maiden that never pierced flesh, the Viking with horns that never fought, the peasant said to stink who in fact washed and wore clean linen. These myths endure not because they match the evidence, but because they shape how we prefer to see the past. The real harm lies in how easily such stories colour our view of people who once lived. If you enjoy this kind of slow, strange history, consider subscribing. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and share the medieval myth you first believed. I'll see you there.